A judge fined him $300 million. But when Kash Patel finally spoke, the entire courtroom went silent. Then the judge started crying. What he said next changed everything. Kash Patel had never walked the easy road, and for those who truly knew his story, that was exactly why he commanded such deep loyalty or fierce criticism. He wasn't a man built for silence, born to hardworking immigrant parents who taught him early that respect isn't given, it's earned. Kash learned to speak up, to stand up, and most of all, to never shrink in the face of pressure. As a young prosecutor, he earned a reputation, not just for his intelligence, but for an unwavering sense of fairness. To him, justice wasn't a game or a political weapon, it was sacred. Later, as he rose through the ranks to become a senior advisor in one of the most controversial White Houses in modern history, he never flinched. In interviews, on stages, behind closed doors, he said what others wouldn't. He carried himself with a kind of quiet defiance, the kind that comes not from arrogance, but from the deep belief that a man must answer only to his conscience and his creator. So when he stepped through the heavy courthouse doors that crisp morning, every eye turned. Not because people were surprised to see him, no. This moment had been building. But because no one knew if this would finally be the moment the system crushed him. The lawsuit wasn't just about money, it was about silencing him. A prominent tech executive, backed by elite legal powerhouses, accused him of defamation, claiming his words on national television had cost her firm hundreds of millions. The case was drenched in politics, money, and power, but beneath all that, it was about one thing. Could a man still speak the truth in America without being destroyed for it? Reporters crowded the steps, murmuring half-written headlines. Courtroom. Security was doubled. Inside, the public gallery filled with faces, some curious, some bitter, a few loyal. Kash, dressed in a plain navy suit and tie, moved like a soldier entering a battlefield. He didn't flash a smile. He didn't wave. He just nodded once to the bailiff, sat down beside his attorney, and waited. Across from him, the plaintiff sat stiff, flanked by lawyers in $1,000 suits and iPads full of exhibits. The judge, an experienced jurist with decades on the bench, entered without ceremony and began the session. For a moment it was just silence, the kind that feels like it could crack glass. And then, the opening statements began. As the lawyers for the plaintiff laid out their case, accusing Kash of reckless speech, misinformation, and financial harm, something in the room changed. The words weren't just technical, they were personal. They painted him as careless, even dangerous, as someone who used his platform to ruin lives. To the casual viewer, it might have seemed like a polished case. But to the men watching who've lived long enough to know what real character looks like, something felt off. The attack wasn't just on Kash's words, it was on the very idea that a man could challenge power and walk away intact. And while the courtroom swirled in legal jargon and media noise, there was one quiet truth hanging in the air. This wasn't just about Kash Patel. This was about every man who's ever been punished for standing up, every worker who's lost a job for speaking honestly, every father who's been told to stay silent for the greater good. That's what made this trial different. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a question to the soul of a country. And for those of you watching, right now, especially if you've ever felt your voice didn't matter anymore, that your years of wisdom were being ignored or erased, this story matters. So if you believe in dignity, in fairness, in the idea that a man should still be able to speak his truth without being financially ruined, subscribe to this channel, because we tell stories that speak to your experience, to your values, to what still matters. We don't chase hype, we chase truth. And as Kash sat there listening to his name be dragged through the mud, he didn't flinch. He leaned back, crossed his hands, and looked straight at the judge. Not defiantly, but like a man ready to be heard. But just when the plaintiff's team began to lay out the financial evidence, claiming hundreds of millions in damage, Kash leaned over to his lawyer and whispered something that made her go pale. Whatever he said, it wasn't part of the strategy. It wasn't rehearsed. It was personal, and as she looked at him, stunned, the courtroom shifted again. Because this wasn't going to end the way anyone expected. The case against Kash Patel didn't come out of nowhere. It crept in like a slow-moving storm, darkening the sky one cloud at a time. It started with a few headlines, whispers in the media about a tech company CEO who claimed she'd been slandered, on national television. At first it seemed routine, just another public spat in the never-ending world of political commentary. But then the numbers started flying. Stock prices fell. Investors panicked. The CEO, a powerful and well-connected woman known more for her influence in boardrooms than public appearances, called it a calculated attack. Her team accused Kash of deliberately spreading misinformation about her company's involvement in foreign government deals, suggesting it compromised national security. The words he had spoken, confidently, directly as he always did, were now twisted into weapons in a courtroom. Her attorneys, polished and relentless, framed Patel's words as not just reckless, but malicious. They pulled quotes from interviews, tweets, podcasts, and turned them into evidence, each sentence stripped of context, loaded with implication. They argued that Kash had known the damage it would cause and did it anyway. Kash, of course, pushed back hard. He stood by every word he had spoken, calling the lawsuit a direct threat to the First Amendment, to free speech, and to the American principle that no citizen should be silenced for exposing uncomfortable truths. But the courtroom wasn't a place for principles. It was a place for rules, for procedure, for whoever had the stronger narrative. And in that carefully controlled environment, Kash began to see the walls closing in. The judge, a seasoned figure known for being fair but firm, kept her expression unreadable as the plaintiff's team delivered chart after chart, showing investor reactions, plummeting earnings, lost partnerships. It was a masterclass in storytelling, and not the kind Kash could easily counter. He wasn't a billionaire. He didn't have 10 lawyers at his side. He had his voice, his documents, and his belief that the truth should be enough. But truth, he was learning, doesn't always win in a courtroom. Watching from the gallery were people who once cheered his every move. Some of them now looked uncertain, others hostile, and a few heartbroken. For many men watching, especially those who had fought and sacrificed in their own lives for what was right only to be punished for it, the trial struck a nerve. It wasn't just Kash on that stand. It was every man who's ever been fired for telling the truth, every veteran who came home and found his honor questioned, every worker who refused to lie for a paycheck and paid the price. As the days passed, it became clear. The fight wasn't fair. Kash's legal team tried to present evidence that supported his claims, government memos, whistleblower reports, independent sources, but objections rained down like hammers. The judge sustained many of them, citing rules of relevance, hearsay, or lack of authentication. The jury, handpicked and visibly uncomfortable, looked more confused by the hour. And through it all, Kash sat quietly, taking notes, whispering occasionally to his counsel, but never raising his voice. He knew what this was. He'd seen it before, power protecting power, using the law like a sword instead of a shield. But still, he hoped for justice. Then came the expert witnesses, finance professionals, brand consultants, public relations specialists, each brought in to testify how Kash's public statements had caused tangible harm. One after another, they explained how a single interview or tweet could ripple into millions in losses. Kash watched them speak about him like he was a virus, not a man. He wanted to stand up and say, "That's not what I meant," or "You're twisting this," but he knew better. In court, the truth doesn't always come through loud and clear. It has to be packaged, polished, admissible. And his wasn't. When the judge finally announced that closing arguments would begin the next morning, Kash barely blinked. He spent that night alone, walking the streets of D.C., reflecting not just on the trial, but on what it meant. He thought of his parents, who came to this country with nothing but faith in fairness. He thought of the people who had written to him over the years, men who had lost jobs, pensions, reputations for standing up to the wrong people at the wrong time. He knew what was coming. The next day, the courtroom was full. Cameras outside, journalists scribbling, final statements made, and then silence as the jury returned. The judge's voice was even, almost cold, as she read the verdict. "We find the defendant liable. Damages awarded to the plaintiff, $300 million. For a second, it felt like the air was sucked out of the room. No one moved, no one spoke. Kash just stood there, not broken, not angry, just still. His lawyer put a hand on his arm, but he didn't move. He looked at the judge, then at the jury, and finally at the plaintiff across the room. There were no words, no reaction, just a man who had lost, but somehow stood taller in the loss than many ever do in victory. And then, as the courtroom buzzed, with shock, and the cameras started to click again, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the edge of Kash's mouth. Not of joy, but of something deeper, because in that moment, even after being crushed by a $300 million judgment, Kash Patel knew something that no amount of money or verdicts could change. They may have taken his voice from the airwaves, but they would never take the truth out of his soul. As the judge gathered her papers and prepared to leave the bench, the courtroom, already heavy with tension, held its collective breath when she paused, eyes locked on Kash Patel one more time. There was something in her expression that softened, just barely. And then she said it. "Do you have anything to say before this court is dismissed?" It wasn't a requirement. She didn't have to offer him that moment, but she did. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe, deep down, even she knew this wasn't just another verdict. All eyes turned to Kash. Cameras clicked, reporters leaned forward, people braced for a fiery speech, maybe even a threat of appeal or retaliation. But Kash stood slowly, buttoned his jacket with quiet dignity, and stepped forward, not like a man preparing for battle, but like one walking straight into the storm with no armor left. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, it wasn't defiant, it was raw. "I won't pretend this verdict doesn't shake me," he said, his voice steady but low. $300 million is more than a fine. It's a message that if you speak too loudly, someone will try to break you. The room didn't stir. No coughs, no murmurs, just silence. He could have blamed the media. He could have attacked the judge. He could have accused the plaintiff of manipulation. But instead, he told a story. Not a political rant, not a strategy, just a story. About growing up in a tight two-bedroom apartment with immigrant parents who worked double shifts, his mother cleaning houses, his father managing convenience stores in neighborhoods most people avoided. He told them how his parents taught him that dignity wasn't about wealth, but about how you carry yourself when no one's looking. He said justice wasn't just something you pursue in a courtroom. It was something you protect every day by telling the truth, even when it costs you. And then he spoke about his days as a federal prosecutor, how he stayed up nights reviewing case files, terrified of putting an innocent man behind bars, how he believed in the law like it was a living thing, something sacred, something he promised to serve. He said nothing about politics, nothing about partisanship, only purpose. And finally, he turned his eyes toward the bench and said with calm finality, "I may have lost this case, but I haven't lost my purpose. If I lose everything for telling the truth, then so be it. I'll sweep floors if I have to, but I will not be silent." The judge stared at him for a moment longer than necessary, then gave a tight nod and adjourned the court. The gavel struck like thunder, and then the fallout began. Outside, reporters swarmed. Commentators dissected every word he'd spoken. Some called it a martyr's speech, others called it a last gasp of a man broken by his own ego. But for those who had watched it live, especially men who had given decades of their lives to families, jobs, country, and truth, it was something else. It was heartbreak. Because they saw in Kash not just a public figure, but a reflection of their own battles. Men who had done the right thing and been punished for it. Fathers who had fought for their kids in courtrooms that didn't care. Veterans who had spoken up about corruption and been buried for it. The verdict had already hit hard, but what came after hit harder. The financial judgment triggered immediate consequences. Patel's personal accounts were frozen within days. Assets seized. Speaking contracts canceled. Longtime allies began to go silent. Some distanced themselves publicly, issuing statements like, "We respect the court's decision," or "This does not reflect the values of our organization." His name, once spoken with either reverence or fire, was now being quietly erased. From conversations, disinvited from panels, scrubbed from bios. Worse still, close friends he had once defended in their hardest moments stopped answering his calls. That kind of silence cuts deeper than any insult. And through it all, Kash didn't yell. He didn't beg. But the weight of isolation grew heavy. Every man knows what it feels like to carry a load you can't share. And for Kash, the weight was now soul deep. His parents, elderly now, watched in worry as their son's name was dragged through every headline. Strangers sent threats. Neighbors looked away. The once comfortable spaces of his life now felt colder, smaller, more dangerous. There was no peace, and then the final blow came. A leaked internal memo from a federal agency, one that Kash had served loyally during his time in government, stated they were reviewing his past conduct in light of the verdict, and might consider reopening old disciplinary inquiries. There was no direct accusation, just enough insinuation to suggest that the system wasn't done with him yet, that even if he'd taken the hit in court, They still might come for his record, his legacy, his entire career. For the first time since the trial began, Kash sat alone in his small DC apartment and let his hands fall into his lap, staring at the floor for what felt like hours. The world had changed around him. The same country that once cheered his honesty now treated him like a pariah. And yet, deep in his gut, he didn't feel regret, only sorrow. Not for the verdict, not for the money, but for what it meant. That a man could stand for truth, sacrifice everything, and still be buried under lies dressed as justice. And just as he reached to turn off the light, his phone lit up with a message from someone he hadn't heard from in years. Someone who once worked high up in the intelligence community. The message was short. Just 3 words that sent a chill down his spine. They weren't done. The courtroom, once humming with tension and sharp judgment, had fallen into a silence so deep you could almost hear the heartbeat of every person in the room. Kash Patel, still standing upright in front of the bench, didn't flinch. Not out of pride, but out of principle. He hadn't expected grace. He hadn't expected sympathy. All he had hoped for was the chance to speak his truth before it was rewritten by headlines and stripped from him by legal documents. But what happened next was something no one, least of all Kash, could have predicted. The judge, who had maintained an iron expression throughout the proceedings, cleared her throat and looked down for a long moment, as if unsure whether to speak at all. She reached for her glasses, fumbled slightly, and finally looked up, her voice lower now, softer, almost unsure. "Mr. Patel," she began, her words deliberate, her eyes glassy. "I've presided over hundreds of cases, some messy, some clear-cut. I've had to sentence men to prison, dissolve families, and sign off on decisions that change the trajectory of people's lives forever." She paused. "But rarely do I hear words that remind me why I took this oath in the first place." The room didn't move. Even the court stenographer had stopped typing, overcome by the quiet weight of the moment. "Justice isn't just about punishment," the judge continued, her voice quivering. "It's about understanding. It's about giving people the space to grow, to explain, not excuse, but explain who they are and why they made the choices they made." Then, her voice caught, just for a breath, but it was enough to shift the air in the room. Her lips trembled, and tears welled at the corners of her eyes. "I followed the law today, Mr. Patel. I did what the statutes required me to do. But your words, they reminded me that the law is only part of the story." A single tear rolled down her cheek, and she made no attempt to hide it. That was the moment everything changed. Not in the legal sense. The verdict still stood. But in the moral and emotional core of the room, what Kash had done, simply by speaking from the heart, had pierced the layers of formality, politics, and public opinion. He had reminded people that behind every decision, there's a human being. Behind every headline, a soul. The media outside didn't get it at first. They were hungry for scandal, for gloating, for drama. But the clip of the judge crying went viral before anyone even left the building. News outlets were forced to change their tone. What had started as a story about a man crushed by justice began to turn into something else, a conversation about what justice really means. Within 24 hours, something remarkable began to happen. Former colleagues who had gone silent reached out privately, saying they were moved, saying they had forgotten what it felt like to believe in someone. A retired general posted a message of support. "I don't care about politics. What I saw today was a man with dignity, taking the hit without bitterness. That takes more courage than most of us will ever know." Veterans groups started, sharing the courtroom video. Men who had served, who had been broken down and rebuilt by the harshest systems, saw in Kash something they recognized. A man stripped of everything but still standing. Not long after, a young associate clerk who had quietly listened to Kash's story contacted a journalist and shared something explosive. Internal emails between the plaintiff's legal team that hinted at coordinated efforts to manipulate media, narratives, suppress certain evidence, and discredit Patel's witnesses before the trial even began. The emails didn't invalidate the verdict outright, but they raised questions, big ones, about fairness, influence, and motive. A respected legal ethics professor wrote a blog post titled, "The Law May Have Spoken, but Was It Listening?" In it, she questioned how the court system could hand out such a devastating judgment without fully addressing whether truth had been buried under process. The public mood began to shift. A petition to reevaluate the case gained 100,000 signatures in a matter of days, not because people suddenly saw Kash as a hero, but because they realized they might have judged too quickly, too easily. that maybe justice wasn't served by watching someone be flattened under the weight of public perception. Through it all, Kash stayed quiet, not hiding, just steady. He continued showing up at community events, helping local causes, shaking hands, listening. No PR team, no press conferences, just presence. When asked why he wasn't fighting back harder, he simply said, "Because I know who I am, and if that's not enough for the system, then I'll build something outside of it that is." And, then came the biggest turn yet. The judge, now facing mounting pressure and reflection, did something unprecedented. She wrote a personal letter, not for the court record, but to Patel directly. In it, she said she could not reverse the verdict, but she was recommending that the Court of Appeals review the case in light of emerging evidence and moral weight. She ended the letter with a single handwritten line. "I'm not sure I made the right decision, but I'm sure you made an impact." That letter leaked, and when it did, the narrative shifted completely. Kash Patel went from being seen as a defeated firebrand to something more profound, an example of grace under fire, of quiet strength in a world screaming for outrage. Even those who had once been his loudest critics began to step back, if not to agree, then at least to respect. The movement to revisit the case grew, not just as a legal issue, but as a national conversation about dignity, consequences, and the complexity of truth in the public arena. Kash didn't ask for it. He didn't march or demand or grandstand. He just kept showing up. But you could feel something rising around him. Not fame, not pity, but a deeper recognition that sometimes a man's strength isn't measured by how loud he yells, but by how long he stands in silence without bending. And just when the tide was finally turning, a sealed envelope arrived at Kash's apartment. No return address, just his name. Inside was a single piece of paper. One sentence. It read, "If you thought the trial was the end, you haven't seen what's coming." The final days following the verdict moved slowly, like the last embers of a fire still glowing beneath ash. Kash Patel didn't celebrate, didn't shout, didn't post any messages. He simply lived each day with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through the storm. The $300 million fine still stood, hanging over him like a shadow, but something about its weight had changed, not because the number had vanished, but because what it represented no longer defined him. For many men, especially those watching from the quiet of their living rooms or the stillness of early morning coffee, there was something deeply familiar in Kash's story. The job loss after years of service, the false accusation that no one questioned, the way people look at you differently when your name gets dragged through the mud, even when you've done everything right. Men who had spent their whole lives standing tall for their families, their principles, their country, watched Kash and saw a reflection of the quiet battles they had fought. And when the cameras turned off, when the reporters moved on to the next outrage, Kash remained. He didn't just endure, he grew. He launched a small nonprofit not with fanfare but with focus, helping young Americans from working-class families understand the justice system, learn how to speak up with conviction, and stand firm even when the ground shakes. Former judges, retired military leaders, and community elders quietly joined his cause. Not because they agreed with everything he'd ever said, but because they recognized the courage it took to take a hit and not throw one back. In time, the appeals process began, inching forward through layers of legal review. The newly uncovered evidence of coordinated narrative control and suppressed testimony began to matter, not to the news cycle, but to the judges whose job was to measure fairness beyond surface impressions. And while no one could undo the pain, the judgment or the scar left by it all, the appellate court ruled that a new trial was warranted, one where the full truth, not just the filtered version, would be heard. But perhaps the most powerful part of Kash's journey wasn't in that legal shift. It was in what happened outside of court. A man who had once been painted as divisive began receiving letters from people who'd once turned away from him. Veterans wrote about the pain of being misunderstood. Fathers wrote about teaching their sons to hold their heads high, even when falsely accused. Even a few former critics admitted quietly and without pride that they had judged too quickly and forgotten that dignity is not always loud. It is often the quiet refusal to become bitter. Kash never asked for sympathy. He didn't demand anyone change their mind. But he showed, day by day, that real strength isn't just about standing tall when people cheer for you. It's about standing taller when they don't. And in a time when it feels like character is too often replaced with clout, that message hit home for a lot of men who've spent a lifetime doing the right thing without asking for applause. By the time his second hearing approached, Kash walked into the courtroom not as a man seeking redemption, but as a man already redeemed by his refusal to be broken. And this time, the room wasn't filled with doubt. It was filled with eyes that saw him fully. The judge addressed him not as a defendant, but as a man whose resilience had moved the country. And while the court still had decisions to make, the weight in the room had shifted from punishment to perspective. Kash had not only faced the system, he had made it look in the mirror. As he walked out of the courthouse that day, again surrounded by cameras, again bombarded with questions, he simply said this: "I didn't walk through this to win. I walked through this so the next man standing here doesn't have to walk alone." There was no victory parade, no thunderous applause, just a moment of silence, deep, honest, and earned. And sometimes, in a world that forgets what dignity looks like, that kind of silence is the loudest sound of all in the end. Life isn't measured by how many times we fall. It's measured by how we carry ourselves when we stand back up. Kash Patel reminded us that dignity isn't given by a courtroom, a paycheck, or a headline. It's earned quietly in how we face the storm. If that message meant something to you, stick around. We tell real stories here, stories that reflect what men like you have lived, endured, and stood for your whole life. Hit subscribe, not for me, but so the next time a story like this comes along, YouTube knows you're the kind of man who still values truth, honor, and grit. I'll see you in the next one.